Hello and welcome to my podcast. Do me a favor, subscribe to the John Keim Report wherever you get your podcast. You watch it on YouTube. You know the deal. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. You can find us there as part of Empire Media. That's AMPIRE. Always much appreciated when you tune in, and you can read my work on ESPN.com. And you can also read my guest work on ESPN.com. That's ESPN's 49ers reporter, Nick Wagoner. I wanted to bring him on to talk about Adam Peters, what he can tell you about Peters that you need to know, and why this is such a good hire for the Commanders. Now, a couple things. I'm going to have another podcast on Monday, so stay tuned for that. And I'll get into more of the coaching stuff at that point. But also, as far as people keep asking about when is the press conference for Peters, it hasn't been set yet. Could be Tuesday, could be Wednesday, but I look for it around then, not Monday, because there are games being played. So it would be like, it most likely would be Tuesday or Wednesday. And again, I'll get into more of the coaching stuff. We got a lot of stuff planned for next week, a lot of good insight coming. So hopefully you stick around or come back for that. Anyway, enough from me. Here's my conversation with ESPN's Nick Wagoner talking about Adam Peters. Nick, we talked about Adam Peters just a few weeks ago when you had the privilege of being on this podcast. So we're back again to go a little bit more in depth on a guy that you know well. What is Washington getting in Adam Peters?
Yeah, it's interesting, John, because when I was on the last time, one of the things that you and I talked about was that Adam Peters isn't just going to leave for any old job, right? Like this, he's passed up some other opportunities. I don't think he's heavily pursued some other ones that maybe he could have gotten in recent years, but he wanted to go to the right situation. It was going to have to be a really good situation to get him away from the 49ers, which is the team that he grew up loving. He's from Cupertino. His family is from here. All of those different things that we talked about. And then when we find out that Bob Myers is going to be heavily involved in the search, it was like, well, I think Adam may be real interested in this. It was pretty easy to connect the dots. So first of all, just from an outsider's perspective, I think for Commanders fans, I'm happy for all of you that are listening right now, because I think it really speaks to what I think, and I've told you this, so you can vouch for me here, that I think it's the best position, the best openings, job, and GM and coach in the league right now. And it's probably been a long time since anyone could say that with a straight face out there. So I think that this situation for Adam is the right thing. It seems like he's going to have a big bulk in the say. He's going to have a big say in the head coach. He's going to have a big say in the structure of the personnel department underneath him. And he's going to get a chance to build something from the ground up. And he did that here as a part of the team, but he wasn't necessarily viewed as the architect, or at least as the lead architect on the project. And so I think that Washington checked a lot of boxes for him. I think it's probably going to be pretty hard for him to leave the 49ers, because I think he's very happy here. But I do think it's the right situation for him. And then as far as what Washington is getting in him, I mean, he is, to me, one of the three most significant figures in the 49ers rebuild since 2017, since John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan got here in 2017. From a personnel standpoint, strictly, maybe the most important figure. And I'm not trying to mitigate, the losses of Martin Mayhew and Rand Carthon and some of the other guys that have left for other jobs over the years. But Adam was the guy who was brought in to be John Lynch's right-hand man, because John Lynch had never been a general manager before, and they wanted to have somebody who could be that guy and kind of help John Lynch learn the ropes and all those types of things, take some of that off his plate. He was instrumental in building the team, particularly with late-round draft picks. The Niners have been as good or better than any team in the league, not just finding useful guys in the late rounds, finding stars. George Kittle in the 5th round, Dre Greenlaw in the 5th round, Brock Purdy in the 7th round, Fred Warner a 3rd round. I mean, I can go on and on. Guys, DJ Jones, who's a really solid defensive tackle for the Broncos, got a $10 million a year deal. He was a 6th round pick of the 49ers. So the track record speaks for itself. I think that it's a great hire for Washington. I think it is a significant loss for the 49ers, but I don't think there's any doubt that it was the right situation. Now, I'm not even sure, John, if he had been, if he hadn't gone to Washington, if there'd been another job in this cycle that he would have wanted. So I do think it speaks really highly, kind of going both ways, that this is a good match.
And what's he known for out there? I know, like, when I've heard people, they talk about, like you said, player evaluation. And one person who's dealt with this league for a long time said that he does a really good job of finding guys that fit the scheme. So
That is the single biggest thing, and is exactly what I was just going to say. Is Kyle Shanahan, to the surprise of no one listening to this, is very particular about what he's looking for in players, and a lot of that isn't necessarily just height, weight, speed stuff that jumps off the tape. Some of it is the stuff that you hear everybody talk about, which is, how much do they love football, which is a hard thing to find out. Guys can fake that, and so it's difficult. So that's a little part of it, but the other part of it is so much of draft evaluation, almost all of it, is projection, right? Like you're looking at a player, what he did in college, trying to determine what his opponent level was like, what his skill set is, and how it's going to translate not just to a level that's more difficult, but to a scheme that is also more difficult, more intricate, all those types of things. And I think that is really where he made his bones. I just alluded to it. I think a lot of those late round picks are Adam Peters heavy. If you go back through them, where he's looking, let's just use George Kittle as an example. They bring in George Kittle. He was a skinny tight end out of Iowa, didn't catch hardly any passes. He was a willing blocker, but not necessarily like a thumping blocker at the college level. And they looked at him and they said, okay, this guy runs fast. He didn't get the ball a lot. He was in a ball control, as Kirk Ferentz offense that had more punting yards this year than they did offensive yards. And it's always been that way. But when we put him in what Kyle Shanahan's going to ask him to do, is he's smart enough to take on all that we're going to ask him to do, because it's not just, can you go in and run block and then run routes and catch passes? It's when you are blocking, particularly in the run game, angles, understanding timing, keeping guys on track, making sure you're not stepping into the running back's track. All of these things that people don't necessarily think about, but like there's a very specific aiming point that George Kittle might have on a run play that if he doesn't hit it, the whole run play is blown up. And so I say all that to say, I think that's where Adam Peters has done a really good job, where he's identifying the specific skills and the strengths of certain guys, and then figuring out how those project into what the coach that he's working with is going to do. And I do think that, if you're looking at, I know you guys are talking a lot about Ben Johnson out there as the primary kind of number one contender for that coaching job. It makes a lot of sense, because I think Adam Peters would find a little easier transition working with another offensive coach who is going to be demanding and asking for things like that, and they're going to be on the same page.
Another one is Bobby Slowick.
Yep.
I mean, I would think that he would be high. I would assume he'd be high on his list. So like, I don't know if you know what their relationship was like, but obviously Bobby and how he is.
Yeah, and it is. I don't know the exact, how close they were or anything like that, but I do know that both of those guys are really smart. And generally smart people, I mean, look at you and I having a conversation right now. Generally smart people generally have conversations and get together and talk. And so I think, Bobby Slowick, I am not at all surprised at the success that he's having in Houston. I actually talked to Kyle Shanahan last week about Bobby Slowick, helping out our teammate in Houston for a story he was working on Bobby. And, Kyle tells the story, and you've probably heard this many times. I've written it. It's been talked about a lot, but I wrote this in 2018. I think it's 2018. Kyle Shanahan will tell you that the single most important thing in his entire coaching career was working in Tampa when he was a quality control coach at night, every night. He would sneak into the defensive meeting room run by Monty Kiffin. Some of the coaches in that room, Mike Tomlin, Herm Edwards, Rod Marinelli, Joe Barry, guys that all went on to either be head coaches or defensive coordinators or both, like just a star-studded cast. And Kyle will tell you that experience, learning defense, the ins and out of defense, is what has made him so successful as an offensive coach. Bobby Slowick, when he got to San Francisco, you know what his job was, John? He was defensive quality control.
So he was here.
And exactly. And the same thing. So that's really a part of kind of the growth that you see. And I think that his understanding of defense from the inside out has made him a successful offensive coordinator. Obviously, if you're Adam Peters right now and you're looking at the situation there in Washington, you're saying, we have the number 2 pick. This is going to be a golden opportunity to get our quarterback. We're probably not going to do what the Niners did in 2017 and pass on him and hope that Kirk Cousins comes to us and then trade for Jimmy. That's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
So you're looking at it and saying, who are the guys that are going to make the most sense, that are going to get that franchise quarterback to that level? Because at the end of the day, the most important people in the organization will be Adam Peters, whoever the coach is, and whoever the quarterback is. And so if he can make sure that all 3 of those things are in alignment right off the bat, I think it's kind of fast tracking whatever type of rebuild is going to be necessary.
And that's a good point too. And like just a couple more, but like Because how long have you covered the Niners now?
2016 was my first year. So I did 1 year of Chip,
Okay.
and then I've been here with Kyle the whole time.
So when they got there, that's what I knew you got there before, when it was kind of a messy situation. So how were they able to turn around? Because it wasn't just like, that was a tough job to go to at that time.
Absolutely. And some of it was, Jed York was in a tough spot because they had been through 3 coaches in 3 years. And so any good coach that was going to go there, he basically just had to give him a blank contract and a check and say, come on, whatever you want to do, we're going to give you an opportunity to do it if you're going to get a good coach. Because, they had the falling out with Harbaugh. Balky and Harbaugh had the falling out. And then they hired Jim Tom Sula, which was just an abject disaster. And then they hired Chip Kelly, which I always say, Chip took a lot of crap here, but he didn't have a chance. Like this was an awful roster. Trent Baalke was on his 3rd coach, has basically had 1 foot out the door, and he and Chip were never really on the same page. So that was like a forced marriage. But the biggest thing, and I think any coach or GM that's done this, guys who've been around the league a long time will tell you, the single most important relationship, hell, Pete Carroll talked about it the other day in his press conference for a while. The single most important relationship you can have in a building, and you're doing this type of job, is between the coach and the general manager. And they don't have to necessarily be on the same page with everything, but they do have to be able to get on the same page. And that can mean disagreements. And in fact, disagreements are encouraged.
Right.
Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch will tell you, I've written about this before. Kyle Shanahan is Mr. Pessimism. He likes to call himself a realist, but John Lynch is Captain America. He's Mr. Optimistic. And so sometimes when they're talking through things, they just inherently disagree on the possibilities. Christian McCaffrey trade is a great example. John Lynch went to Kyle Shanahan and said, let's trade for Christian McCaffrey. I think we could do this. Kyle Shanahan said, no way. We don't have any 1st round picks. This is going to be too expensive. We can't do this. John Lynch is like, just give me some time. We work on it. Of course, Kyle was on board with the player. It was just the idea of how you get from A to B. Anyway, I say that because I think that is the number one thing. And it's why I admire what Washington is doing, because they're being diligent about trying to get who they want to be their figurehead, but also making sure that he's in place so that they can bring in a coach and make sure that they are simpatico, that they can work together. And that's the whole thing where, the Trent Baalke thing didn't work with Jim Harbaugh. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But let's say you're Washington and you wanted to hire Jim Harbaugh, or you wanted to hire Bill Belichick. Well, now you're giving them basically total control here, where I think you're going to get a little bit more of a cooperative with what you're going to look at there. And I think that is the most important thing, because you need that push and pull. It's like creative tension almost, I think, between coach and GM. And I think it's really important to have, so long as at the end of the day, when they do make a decision, even if they disagree on the ins and outs of that decision, when they make that decision, they're on the same page and they move forward together.
Right. And I think that's a big key, because it's like people hear same page and think it's never universal agreement. It shouldn't be, because if it is, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. I think the way you challenge somebody is by sometimes disagreeing with them and forcing them to come to defend that. And you see the conviction and all that. So that, I agree with that. Like when Joe Gibbs was here with Bobby Bethard, they didn't always agree, but they built Super Bowl champions. So the last 2 things: one, Martin Mayhew worked there with Adam Peters. What do you think this might mean for Martin Mayhew? And by the time this comes out, we may have an idea, Mayhew, but what do you think this might mean for him? And what was his reputation with the Niners?
I mean, everybody really liked Martin. I mean, anyone that's been around him out there, I'm sure, feels the same way. Just a class guy, a smart guy, just friendly, works really hard, all those types of things. He was the guy when they brought in Adam Peters, because Peters was relatively young when they brought him to San Francisco, at least in terms of holding a higher up position within the personnel department. So Martin was kind of going to be John Lynch's veteran guy that he could bounce stuff off, who'd been through things. So if he said hey, we're talking about this trade, when you made this trade for Detroit or whatever, what was that like? Can you talk, can you give me insight into how it played out? And so I think they had a really nice balance back then between Adam and Martin, where they were both sounding boards, but in kind of different ways, where Adam is kind of the young hot shot, for lack of a better term, but who's really good with personnel evaluation. And then Martin could kind of be there as the sounding board, who understands how this thing works, and he could maybe point out the flaws in someone that maybe others couldn't think, or maybe has a little bit better handle on, hey, this guy may not love football as much. Those types of things that we were talking about, where he's just been around so long that he can recognize certain things. So I don't necessarily know. I mean, you know better than me, of course, that that it wouldn't be impossible for Martin to stay and keep working with Adam. I wouldn't be surprised by that. I'm not, to my knowledge, there's no like bad feelings there or anything. I think they get along. So I could also see a scenario in which Martin comes back to San Francisco. If they do decide to part ways there in Washington. So I don't have any doubts that he's going to land on his feet one way or the other. But yeah, I don't necessarily know how Adam views that. I guess that just depends on what kind of structure he wants to build out. But again, for him, even still as a relatively young guy, as a GM for the first time, or as the head of football operations for the first time, having a sounding board who's been around and done that like Martin is probably not a bad thing.
No, and Martin is a smart guy, and so I think he does what he is asked. I think he understands how to fill the role he's asked to fill. So that's always a good thing. Last thing, I also heard that in the locker room, and you would know better, that Peters was pretty respected, that guys seem to like him. And I don't know how important that is as a general manager, but I think it's good when you have it. Is that a fair description?
They definitely liked him. I have no doubt about that. I can tell you that right firsthand from talking to guys that they liked him. And I do think it matters. And I think, one of the things that John Lynch has done here that he's like kind of the thing he was best at right away is that personal side of the job. And in a lot of ways, we're sitting here talking, and I'm not trying to say that John Lynch hasn't done a good job on the personnel side. I'm just saying that I think Adam Peters had a big hand in a lot of that kind of stuff, and Kyle did as well. But what John is a unifier. Like John was the guy who, when the culture was broken, he's the guy who's helping forge the culture that you want. And so he's the guy who's in the locker room and has a relationship with all these guys and is talking to them all the time. And hey, is there anything I can do to help you? I'm just using safety, which is an easy example because it was the position that he played. But Talanoa Hufanga does not hesitate to go to John Lynch when he has questions about safety play and things that he's seeing and calculating his instincts versus what the scheme is asking him to do and when it's right to take risks and all those kinds of things that only a guy like John Lynch, who's a Hall of Fame safety, can know. And so I say that because I don't think Adam Peters obviously doesn't have a Hall of Fame playing career under his belt that guys automatically are going to respect. But I do think Adam watched that stuff. I think Adam was around a lot, and you always saw him in the locker room. You saw him around, paying close attention to how things were being done here. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. It's not just a one-to-one. You can't just transfer 49ers culture to Washington, but I do think at least gives you an idea of this is what it's supposed to look like. And just to give you one more example, I spent some time yesterday with Steve Wilkes for a story that I'm working on. Steve obviously has been through the ringer a bit, in terms of kind of unfair opportunities with him as a head coach. Didn't work out in Carolina, didn't work out in Arizona. And I asked him, I said, Steve, what is like when you go into coaching searches now, and his name has come up in Atlanta, it's come up with the Chargers. Maybe it comes up there because he and Adam know each other, here relatively soon. But I said, what is the thing that you took away the most from that experience? And he said, I know my purpose now. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, my purpose is, when you're a young coach and you're just trying to latch on, you're trying to get a job for the first time, and this probably applies to GMs too. You just want one of the 32 jobs, right? There's 32 jobs and they're hard to get. So you just take you take the one that is offered to you. And he said, I can't do that anymore. It needs to be the right situation. It needs to be a situation where everybody's on the same page. The resources are there. The ownership is involved in the way that they're giving you what you need to succeed, but not overly involved so that they're meddlesome. Those types of things. And I say that because I think that is what an Adam Peters understands. He understands that even better than Steve Wilkes because he's been here longer. But he knows that these are the things that he's going to have to instill, and these are the things that he's going to want, where you got to get the coach and the GM on the same page, and then you start finding players who fit in with what you're trying to do, and then it all works from there. That was a super long-winded answer.
No, it's great.
I bounced all over the place, but that is I think what you're going to see there in Washington.
That's great. And I think, does this complete the Trent Williams trade that Washington finally got something back?
It might. Do you remember who did they end up drafting with the picks they got? Do you remember?
Oh, you know what? I have to double check. I forget. And it was not a good trade for them. So
it worked out okay for the 49ers,
yes,
but
did.
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
But anyway, Nick, thank you. That's great insight. And, I think people in Washington should be excited because this was the Grand Slam hire as described to me. I think Ian Cunningham was a really good candidate, but I think they got the guy that they needed. And so we'll see what happens next. Nick, thanks a lot.
You got it, John. See you, bud.
That's it for this episode. Thanks to Nick for joining me, and thank you, as always, for tuning in. I'll be back on Monday with another podcast. I'll talk to you next time.